All righty. Brother Dr. Herb Boyd.
All right.
How are you feeling today?
Back where I belong.
Wow.
In the heart of Kemet.
Wow. Herb,
Sure.
it is a pleasure and an honor to have you back in the studio again. It's been
Oh, it's a pleasure too. You know that.
years. And I did want to talk to you about Professor Evo, but not today.
Oh yeah, we got that scheduled. We want to go out there with where he is, though, right?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, I'd like to go out there and see where he is.
See, they just did a thing with Stephen Hawking beaming his voice
Yes.
into a black hole. But Stephen Hawking and did nothing compared to what Professor Evo has done.
Talk about dark matter, huh?
Absolutely.
Melanin deep, man.
What it's about people who believe in you, getting behind you, and pushing you.
I know.
That's really what it's about. Now, we have the greatest scientist of humanity in Professor Evo.
Yes.
And we can back that up with documentation from places like the universities in Germany, the biggest one where Gauss, the home of Gauss, you know, who they consider the greatest mathematician on the planet ever.
Mm-hmm. Some of those quotes that you have in the piece, is in the Panther book.
Yeah,
Those,
right.
Oh yeah, you got those two very interesting quotes there.
So it's up to us to do this. Nobody's going to do it for us. In fact, they're going to try to make sure that that information,
It's erased.
and that's what they're doing with Stephen Hawking and others. They're trying to claim. Anyway, let me go over what I'd like to talk about in depth. I want to look at black life during slavery.
Sure.
Because we either know very little about Africans doing slavery,
Sure.
their resistance, how they managed to survive. We have a very vague picture of our struggle and how heroic that struggle was and what we did. Actually, I was looking at some of these Ethiopian tapes, which I have probably about 50 hours. And I filmed the whole service, the Trinity Church, Ethiopian church in Addis Ababa. And I was amazed at their singing that, what do they call that? And then it's picked up on the other side, and it sounds just like the African Episcopal Methodist Church.
It does something. Wow.
Identical. I decided to mix the sounds, and you can't tell the difference. And I said to myself, how did our people pick this up? So I'm just saying that there's so much continuity.
Yes.
That we maintain.
That's the key word. That's that key word, continuity.
In our genes and our soul. And it's here today, but we can't seem to sort it out because our names have been changed, our bloodlines have been mixed, and we've experienced Willie Lynch. So I want to look at black life during slavery.
Sure.
I want to look at the contributions of Africans enslaved. What are those countries? How did they build America?
Oh, brother.
Because very few of us really understand that it was the Africans in America that built both Europe and America.
Exactly.
To make it the great country, and they just didn't do it physically. They did it physically and mentally.
No doubt.
So
whole layout and design and the actual point of production, working at the point of production. And it's throughout our whole history in the diaspora. Go to Brazil, you know, you can see elements of it there. all across Central America. I mean, you go into the Mayan and the Olmec civilization, you can see the Africans and Van Sertima. That's Van Sertima's land.
Since we done got started,
Yeah,
I want
just
to
keep
cut
it
you
going.
so I can ask you some questions.
Sure.
But since we're on that, let's deal with that.
Sure, no doubt. Well, you know, when you're talking about the much of what I have, and I always like to kind of anchor and put a foundation in my lectures in my classroom, I proceed in a similar fashion. You know, make sure I first of all give honor and cite some of the historians, some of the activists, some of these personalities and notables that have influenced me over the years. Now, I've been living in Harlem now since 1985. And fortuitously, I'm not that far from City College, where I've been teaching now since 2005. Before that, I spent 26 years at the College of New Rochelle. But Brother Clemson, what advantages I've achieved by being in New York and coming of age in Detroit. My most recent book is called Black Detroit, A People's History of Self-Determination. And I think that's going to be a key word, kind of a thematic and narrative concept that drives our discussion this afternoon, is to talk about the African sense of self-determination, carving out a place in the universe, despite all of the horrific obstacles and challenges and attacks to erase us as a people. In that sense, I'm reminded of the contributions of Dr. John Henry Clark, Cheikh Anta, Dr. Ben, a lot of the individuals who have helped and shape your own understanding and your own perspective in terms of how do we grasp, propagate, and perpetuate our history and culture. And I think that, and I'm going to say this on camera too, is that I can think of only a few individuals who have been as consistent, has been as progressively productive as you've been as a documentarian. And it is my dream one day is to go down in that basement of yours and begin to take some of the assemblage, the clips, the interviews, this collection of history that you've compiled over the years and put it in a format so we can make it widely available to a larger population of people who have to understand what you've done as an individual. We cannot lose that legacy of yours. And that's one of my dreams and hope. And we're getting, as you said earlier, you know, the clock is ticking on us. But I think we got a little bit more time and energy. And it's just a matter of focus and concentration. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things we want to talk about this afternoon is the global presence, the African presence, you know, across the universe and beyond. Because there's something absolutely immutable about the African and the Black experience in this universe. I used to start out my classes and I would take them back from an anthropological standpoint. I say, let's go back to East Africa. Let's go back to the continent and begin to look at some of these millions of years that they talk about in terms of the human presence on the planet. And we have to struggle all the time, we people blessed with melanin, we have to struggle hard to make sure that people understand what role we play in that, almost in a seminal way. Because when you go back to the origins of things, for me, it all starts with Africa. In the beginning was Africa. and the word was going to be struggle. We try to hold on to that particular unique presence that we've had in the evolution of humankind. I studied anthropology at Wayne State University in Detroit, and in all those classes, I never heard Sheikh Anta Diop's name mentioned. I never heard anything about Grimaldi. Nothing at all about the possibility that these first humans, these first humanoids and hominids that walked the planet were actually black people. And it's only later on when you begin to gather an understanding, a better consciousness, political and cultural consciousness. And of course, the whole movement of the 1960s and a little bit out of the civil rights movement was very instructive because it began to give us a sense of a peoplehood. You know, we have a history, despite all of the negation, and particularly of white historians, to eradicate, to remove us from that story, from that narrative. We have a place there, a very prominent role, and it's been my obligation, and I've been devoting all of my years to make sure that the young people, and particularly my students in the classroom, you gather some notion and understanding of the kind of primacy, you know, of the African presence. And so we always start in the beginning. We take them all the way back to Australopithecines. We begin to look at some of the work that the Leakeys did, the Louis L.S.B. Leakey, Mary Leakey, Richard Leakey, the Leakeys. However, even in looking at these prominent, notable European anthropologists, and some of them, you know, made contributions that we dare not ignore, and others we can just completely refute and dismiss. I always kind of, okay, let's talk about the Leakeys, because what they did, what they recognized is that they didn't know it all. They had to talk to the African people, the indigenous people.
Right.
They had to talk to Kamoa Kumu. This is the African the Kenyan that worked with them, who took them to some of these old fossils. And always, the people always understand, say, Kamau, how did you know where to find, for example, you know, some of the things that they call Cro-Magnon later on, but going all the way back to some of the Australopithecines. How did you know to find these in this valley? We talk about Olduvai Gorge now.
Right.
You know, you're going out to the Serengeti. And he said, the bones talk to me.
I remember.
Remember that? The bones talk to me. And he knew exactly where to go and pick them up. And he could turn them over to these people who had the processes, who had, like, you know, the carbon-14, and can put it into the photo labs and what have you, and begin to break down the genetic aspects, the DNA aspects of the bones. So really, it starts with the kind of perspicacity that this African had to go to find what you're looking for. And then you can put it through the various scientific processes and analyzing it and try to find out where these fossils come from and to what extent they contain the kind of material that'll help us understand the general evolution of humankind. So it starts with the African genius of knowing exactly, and I think all anthropologists would be wise to, when they go into territory, you know, into parts of the continent where they have no knowledge or think they know it all, they better talk to somebody who's been there and who's kept a log that history, absorb that history, and can dispense with it and let you know exactly what's going on. So they have to raise these questions. They have to talk to people, raise the questions, and can you help me in this? Can you help me? And they can guide you in such a way if you are responsible and have some sense of sharing because you have to share. And that was one of the things that you go back to, you kind of fast forward, from out of the early anthropological phase down, even when when Livingston, when you're into the 19th century, when you have the general push of the Europeans, coming on Africa. But we have to understand that the whole history, first of all, it was a migration from Africa.
Right.
And it probably, according to some of the studies, indicate that it went 3 different ways out of Africa. And certainly with Cheikh Job's discussion is that the one major migratory path took us across the Sahara Desert. Of course, once upon a time, it was not a desert.
Right.
You dig it? But that kind of desiccation that occurred over centuries and boom. And so they began to migrate out of the continent across where Morocco and Tangiers and across the Straits of Gibraltar and Algeciras into southern Spain. And then began to spread from there. And they began to talk about the whole question of Cro-Magnons or, some of the Neanderthal, and whether or not that may have been precipitated, the clash of these cultures may have been the first race war between these people. And we're talking about 35, 40,000 years ago. So it's an enormous stretch of time. It's almost inconceivable, how much time that is. Because you figure like the United States of America in terms of its history would be like that in terms of the long evolution of time on the planet.
Right.
They've been here but a hot second, a nanosecond compared to the clock of time, the calendar that Dr. Clark talked about, that clock. It's a long period of time. But anyway, you have this here migration. That's one of the major ones because that begins to populate Europe. Another one moving another way begins to populate Asia as you move across the Red Sea into Egypt and in Ethiopia. Out of that territory, those people had moved across the Red Sea. And then down to East Africa, those who began to depart there. All of this is suggesting that these black people who were on Africa began to spread all over the globe. And you can find elements of that no matter which culture you look at. In Europe, in Asia, if you look at part of Central Europe, you'll find the African presence there. It's all there. It's just coming through okay?
No, it's coming
okay,
through
good. I think that one of the things about I want to get down to the central concern we have is that the survival of black people in spite of all this, because I think there's something innate about our ability to survive no matter the circumstances. It's almost like indecipherable. How do you begin to understand that? And whether or not that's and you can get all mystical and metaphysical about it in terms of certain kind of vitality and genetic matter that we have that give us that sustaining power. I do believe that has to be taken into consideration. But more than anything, we talk about a very materialistic way in which we encounter the elements, incidents, and other very, very hostile people who have nothing on their minds but our elimination and how we have dealt with that. There was a time, though, when our forces were depleted, that we had great disadvantages, with conquering people. And when you start talking about the transatlantic slave trade and what was happening in East Africa too at that time, in terms of the general expropriation, snatching off people, the kidnapping, taking over, as Walter Rodney talked about it in his book, how Europe underdeveloped Africa and that whole process. But even with that, and kind of depleting the African continent of a workforce, of a creative energy, of a vision. that they had there as a people. Suddenly, you have this imposition. These folks come in from the outside and destroy that whole process. Because we had a process in motion before the invasion of Europe. And that's a stultifying situation. It's hard to recover from that. Comparable to that, Clemson, we kind of pushed down to the whole slave period when the slavery, at the end of the Civil War, when you get into the Reconstruction period, and that's just a short space of time from 1865 to 1877, just some 12 years, in which, you have 4 million people coming out of servitude, out of bondage, and suddenly just thrown out there to make it on their own without any kind of governmental support.
What were some of the achievements, if I may interrupt?
Out of that period?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. But first of all, you talk about a situation where you have to go back to the slave era itself and see all of the contributions. And some of that's a carryover from the African background, because it's something about Africanisms, the retention of certain creativity and ingenuity, whether it's in smelting iron, whether it's architectural development, layout and design, all of this stuff here, that the subject matter that you can contain, within your art and your music. All of this, you have to go back to the African background, the African experience, to see how those things are without any kind of mutation, and how it moves across the ages, no matter what kind of conquest you go through. Many people look for this African genius, and it's there and it's prominent. So some of the stuff that was very, very part of our African experience, the Africanisms, we can transport that stuff. We talk about being in bondage and slavery. Well, they took advantage of our genius. Those slaveholders knew exactly the possibilities that they had with these African captives, and how to utilize them in such a way to empower and to embellish, their own meager, and I would say that, advisedly, but I'm sure that, they understand some of the inadequacies and some of the things that they were less endowed, and that's from a physical, mental, and a spiritual standpoint, and how you can take advantage of that with these African captives, and they certainly did. Building up this whole country, and you can look at the contributions we've made in so many ways, from an agricultural, moving right into the material cultures and the building of cities, the whole housing situation across the South. We can see how absolutely prominent that was. Just recently, they had this exhibit of Sally Hemings that opens up down in Charlottesville, down in Virginia, right? The whole Monticello thing, the Thomas Jefferson, all of that stuff is kind of coming to the fore again. And I think that's exemplary of what we're talking about, in terms of, if you just take that particular moment in time, and you can go both ways with it. You can take it all the way back, long before Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. We even thinking about the possibility, of Africans, captives being liberated, emancipated, long before this U.S. Constitution. Or you can bring it forward to Charlottesville, last year, when you had a situation right there. This melee occurred in which these white nationalists, and again, that's a perpetuation from a Thomas Jefferson to the white nationalists, last year, in which the young woman was killed and a number of people were injured. So if you stop it and freeze it, let's freeze it before, here you're talking about, in the 18th century, with Thomas Jefferson, this your so-called founding father, is already, creeping through the slave quarters.
Right. Was
and
all-
mating
yeah.
and mating with Sally Hemings. And so now we have this here particular exhibit that's going on, and they're beginning to go back and look at that situation in terms of what it meant for the black family. I did a piece came out in this week's Amsterdam News on one of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson's sons, Easton Hemings, and how he was a tremendous violinist, but also just a superb carpenter. And you look around Monticello and you see how beautiful that whole structure, the architecture that went into that. That was black design, black architect, and black labor. All went into the building of this here. And Mount Vernon, the same thing, with George Washington, the slave labor. So at the point of production has been black workers in the history of America. In the same way, those same kind of, you call carpenters and brick masons and architects and all those individuals involved in the foundation of metalwork,
Right.
all, coming out of the African experience, So here you've got them over here, you got them in captivity, and they can begin to carry out some of those things that from a labor standpoint, you're not prepared to do. The Native Americans, they ran off. You couldn't confine them in the same way because the Africans were being brought here and did not know the lay of the land. And when they did run away, it was easy for them to capture them again. And of course, then the punishment that was often meted out for those who dared, run away from the plantation. But then again, you go back and see the resistance. See, that's another word that's kind of missing when we talk about African American history and culture, is the element of resistance. Because this is going to be part and parcel, of our history in the whole encounter that we have with these invading forces coming from the outside, trying to snatch us away from our homeland. There was resistance in the beginning. We don't talk enough about it. So much of it because we were overpowered, and we had a number of other things going against us at that time. Even some people who were we thought were our own people, who were part, of that whole absolutely complicit in the transatlantic slave trade. That was not the prominent thing, though, because you do have these, it's a whole history. You talk about the Atlantic Ocean. I think Amiri Baraka said it very well. There's just a whole trail of bones under the Atlantic, of African people who chose to take their lives and not have you take their lives and jumping overboard. So that's a struggle there. The mutinies that occurred on the slave ships, the Amistad in 1839, that's an example right there of African self-determination's reluctance to be a part of this process. No. And then when you get here, here in New York, for example, we've had like 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5 major slave uprisings, rebellions. That's another thing that's not talked about enough in terms of the resistance. How many slave uprisings and rebellions, upheavals this year, like outcries, outrage of being like, shackle me in, turn me into chattel. Go back to 1712, 1741, right here in New York. You had major slave uprisings, people who were just, no, we're going to break the shackles and break these chains. And then you have the major ones we talk about all the time, 1800, Gabriel Prosser, 1822, Denmark, BC, 1831, Nat Turner. This is kind of like, Herbert Aptheker has a very fine book on African slave revolts. Cato at Stono in 1837. That's often left out of that record. But that's true. It was not only true on the land mass here, but also in the Caribbean. Because you have a similar kind of development in terms of people being kidnapped, snatched from their homeland and distributed all over the Western world. From the archipelago in South America all the way up through Brazil, where you have the largest concentration of African people of African descent anywhere outside of the African continent. It's just amazing. But what you're talking about, Clemson, though, is that the contributions we made politically, scientifically, culturally, the standpoint of even institutional, social organization, you know, how we have like put our genius on situations where, you know, suddenly you have a huge influx of people, the demographic shifts that have occurred. Of course, the slave trade is a major demographic shift. You know, that's millions of people, and we still argue about how many people. Dr. Clark always broke it down like 20, 20, 20. Like 60 million overall, 20 million who never really got off the continent and across the water. Another 20 million who died in that process, you know, the seasoning process being broken in. And then the other 20 million who we are the descendants of, they survived. So, but sometimes that number goes as high as 300 million. You know, 300 million that's snatched from the African continent. That's a tremendous number. You've heard that number. So it goes to the high number, to the low number. The historians and the European historians keep the number low. They keep it, well, maybe 9 million. You know, some of the outstanding white historians, they take a very conservative look in terms of the numbers, but whatever it is, we know that a vast number were taken from the continent, and that had like an impact on the continent. So often we talk about, like, you know, what did it mean in terms of development in the West, but what did it mean to the diminishing and the decline, you know, of the African presence? What happened to these African communities, societies, nations that were disrupted? So it was a disruption that occurred when they came in. There was a process of development that had been going on for centuries. And suddenly, you know, poof, you have this huge obstacle that's thrown at first. So they got to recover from that. In the same way, after slavery in this country, you have 4 million people who are abandoned by the government. We think today about the situations that are going on with separation of families, with the whole Trump administration, the horrific, menacing aspects of that. It's nothing new to the black family. Correct. It's something that we can talk about that for days in terms of what the disruption, what that meant, and the whole recovery process. How long does it take you to get back? Because you've got 4 million people who have been enslaved, you know, for more than 200 years. And suddenly, you know, the Civil War comes along, and that whole thing, that process ends, but then you just tossed to the wolves. You're out there to make it on your own, you know, and so the federal government comes in with the Freedmen's Bureau at the end of the war, but that's short-lived. You know, that's not long enough to have any kind of substantial impact in terms of changing the possibilities of these people surviving, though they survived. Mm-hmm. You know, the vagrancy laws, we survived. The hostility of the Ku Klux Klan, we survived. The whole reaction that they had, and white people, the Southerners coming back, the slaveholders being renewed, because you had Lincoln assassinated, Andrew Johnson comes in as the president and begins to pardon all of these Southerners. Because the land question is critical. Mm-hmm. We have to understand, in all of these developments being snatched off of our homeland, then thrown onto these plantations and farms, and small and large, you know, that was a situation in which we, you know, that's forced labor without any compensation. That's why we talk today about reparations. You know, how do we begin to get those reparations? You know, the land question.
Can you talk about the government's involvement in that, from pulling out troops and leaving?
Oh, brother.
Can you talk about
that? Sure. But see, first of all, I put it in the context of compromise. Mm-hmm. The United States was formed, if you look at the Constitution, you know, it's a document of compromise. You know, you look at the Declaration of Independence, a document of compromise. And we've had compromises from the very inception of the United States, a compromise was made because to some extent, we talk about the indigenous population, what happened with them in terms of the treaties that was violated, you never fulfilled, But you get to the compromise of 1820, that's the Missouri Compromise. Mm-hmm. At that time, you had a situation where you had 22 states slavery and 22 non-slavery. And suddenly you got Missouri coming in. They want to come in as a slave state, so they bring Maine in as a free state in order to keep that balance between it. So even there, that's a compromise. That's a compromise. That's 1820. You get down to 1850, that's the Fugitive Slave Act, which of course is the compromise of 1850. What that meant is that they turned these slaveholders and their bounty hunters loose on runaways and fugitives. Many of them using the Underground Railroad to get out of there. Mm-hmm. So then you go from there to 1877, which I think is the most dramatic and I think that was a devastating compromise in terms of the country's progress or lack thereof. 1877, the compromise there, it happened when Rutherford B. Hayes was seeking the presidency against Samuel Tilden from New York, the governor. And it ends up in a situation where, almost like a dead heat. So how do we solve this situation? That's when Congress steps in. And that's really the beginning of the Electoral College process that put Trump into power. But it was called an Electoral Commission at that time. So they had to come up with a compromise. And the compromise was Rutherford B. Hayes being a Republican, Tilden being a Democrat. We said we'll make Rutherford B. Hayes the president if he removed the troops, these Union troops, from the South. It was really just three states, Florida, Louisiana, Carolina. I think those were the three states where they removed the troops. You only talk about 5,000 troops. Mm-hmm. I don't know how you could figure 5,000 troops would be necessary, would be effective at all in terms of the number of people who no longer in bondage and needing protection.
But most of those troops black?
No, they were not. Only a few were black, from what my understanding. Most of them were Union, the former Union fighters who had been dispatched. The blacks would have just antagonized, the population even more, because another element of that. What it really antagonized them there was the political situation that grew out of the Reconstruction period, because if we can talk about any benefits and contributions that are kind of like ongoing, it would be the educational process. That was the major achievement coming out of that whole Reconstruction period in the Freedmen's Bureau, what they did there. All of the historically black colleges and universities came into existence at that time, right?
Yes.
Atlanta University in the beginning, all the way down to Meharry, medical school in Tennessee, all of those and all the stops in between, Howard University, Hampton, even Hampton comes before, because Hampton was an Indian school. That's where Native Americans, that's where Booker T. Washington went to school. He went to Hampton after walking some 500 miles from Malden, West Virginia to get him some education. Talk about self-determination, y'all. That's a long walk to freedom, yes.
Was Clemson University a part of the HUBs in this?
No, not to my knowledge.
Okay,
somebody
told me that.
Yeah. But you have like the whole South, 2 or 3 or 4, about 5 or 6 South colleges into South Carolina that came out of, not at the same time, but shortly thereafter, they began to emerge. But of course, the prominent ones will always be Morehouse and Howard, particularly Howard University, McKent Fisk. Fisk is very important, Shaw University. All these things are very important in terms of the development of education. However, what does that mean beyond? Yes, on the college level, what was happening below K through 12 and across the South? Well, in the beginning, it was going in a very gradual way. You could see that African Americans were being brought into the process. But at the same time that you can see this evolution in which we're beginning to gain some power And first, from a political standpoint, look at all the, well, not all that many, because we only had 22, in a 12-year period, we only had about 22 African Americans who were real prominently in Congress. Mm-hmm. And most of them were representatives, because we only had 2 senators, and they never run concurrently. There was Blanche, K. Bruce, and was it, and Rebels. Those were the only 2, one from Mississippi, right? The rest of them were state representatives, and they were some powerful individuals too. When you start talking about John R. Lynch and Langston, to say nothing of Robert Brown Elliott. I mean, all these are important individuals at that time. But what happened is that you had a reaction, and remember the Civil War for some of those Confederates, it never ended. It was never over for them. Lee may have surrendered, but they didn't. Mm-hmm. You take General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Mm-hmm. He went home to Pulaski, Tennessee, and he was one of the key founders of the Ku Klux Klan. Mm-hmm. Remember, he had the Fort Pillow massacre. Yeah. Right. And people had they surrounded, the Confederate forces surrounded the Union forces at that time at the Fort Pillow, where some more than 250 African Americans soldiers were in there too, and they surrendered because they were. And as soon as they surrendered, I mean, they went in there and massacred most of them. We know that story because some of the blacks escaped to tell that story. In the same way that when John Brown had his raid on Harper's Ferry, mm-hmm. He had 5 black men who rode with him. And people don't talk enough about this self-determination. All they see is this John Brown and his courageous efforts, and they see radical abolitionists and what have you, but he had at least 5 blacks rode with him at Harper's Ferry. Only one of them survived to tell a story, Osborne Anderson. And he escaped to Canada. He went off to Chatham, Ontario, hooked up with Mary Shadd up there. Mm-hmm. He began to write in The Voice of Harper's Ferry. It was his outstanding document. And no one had that kind of report, first-hand account of what happened at Harper's Ferry, other than Osborne Anderson, a black man, telling our story, telling John Brown's story at that point too. So that's important, because then you go back to looking at these black politicians and the whole Ku Klux Klan and Night Riders, the White Knights of the Camellia, all of them, they're vamping down on this black progress. Mm-hmm. But that's institutions that are being built in certain communities where they can see that, we got control of this state government. We got a few, there was not enough governors at that time. I think only one PBS Pitchback down in Louisiana, was the only, and that was just a temporary thing there. But let's get to the next compromise. I mean, even before that, you can go back and talk about in 1857, the Dred Scott decision.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a very important, because that begins to negate us as a people, mm-hmm. and the empower the whole white nationalism comes to power, white supremacy, because they're saying that black people have no laws we are bound to respect. Mm-hmm. So that began to, boom, another roadblock on us. And then you go to 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. That's another major setback for us in terms of struggling for human and civil rights in this country. So all of this here is, what we're saying is that how do we begin to get over these obstacles thrown in front of us? We're not given the educational opportunities. The government does not aid us. The Freedmen's Bureau was short-lived. It got so bad with the Freedmen's Bureau that Frederick Douglass, mm-hmm. out of his own savings, had to kind of hand over $5,000 in order to salvage the Freedmen's Bureau. But that was not enough money to salvage that organization. I mean, you have 4 million emancipated blacks. That's hardly enough money. Maybe take 1 or 2 families, that's it. So, but nonetheless, he went into his bank account because the Freedmen's Bank was busted. It'd been ripped off. you know, because at the time that's going on at that time, you have scallywags, you have copperheads, you had carpetbaggers, you know, different kind of individuals who all found a way to profit. But the carpetbaggers are different because these are Northerners who are coming down to the South. At this period of time, we talk about the educational development. The Charlotte Thornton, you know, some of the school moms that came down from New England to teach in the South, that Port Royal experiment. Charlotte Thornton would be exemplary of that. You know, they saw her as a carpetbagger. You know, in terms of the bags they carried coming in, their luggage and stuff coming from the north down to the south. And you had copperheads also. You know, these scallywags who would be like copperheads would be interesting because you talk about Northerners, you know, and as they relate to the situation in the South, scallywags being those Southerners who kind of switched over and tried to profit off of these carpetbaggers who came down. But at the same time, you know, what's going on is that the Ku Klux Klan is becoming more powerful all the time. And they're going to have a renewed power when it gets to the birth of a nation, 1915. Because there's a period of time, you know, during the 1880s, 1890s, and that's a flourishing period for what we call the first Renaissance of African-American cultural activity. We always talk about the Harlem Renaissance, but see, Renaissance, as Dr. Clark used to say, Renaissance, you dig it? That's rebirth. It's rebirth of what? So if it's the Harlem Renaissance from 1920s, then where's the first one? That's the 1880s and 1890s in different parts of the country. You know, particularly when you have, from a literary standpoint, you had a number of very prominent writers. You know, we talk about Frank Webb and Charles Chestnut, Paul Laurence Dunbar. You know, these individuals who set the stage for Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen, Arnold Bontemps, these people who came along in the 1920s. That's again a part of that kind of this cultural legacy, a part of the self-determination, because that the creative mind, the educators that later on produced like a Carter Woodson, you know, that began to grow out of the education system at that time, which of course was not that well developed. You know, did not give the prominence that we deserved at that time to educators who took it upon themselves. You know, what you have here is the progress and achievements of colored people. Interesting they say colored people, huh? The nomenclature that changes over the years is very interesting. You know, because once upon a time it was African. If you look back in time, when you mentioned it earlier in terms of the African Methodist, the Episcopal Zion, what have you, they said African, didn't they?
Yes.
So early on, it was a connection, a very, very immediate connection to where we had come from. And don't get into the other changes of nomenclature that occurs because sometimes politically motivated, sometimes, you know, growing out of our own definition of what we choose to call ourselves, and then the fight for that. But I noticed that colored continues only with one organization.
NAACP.
That's it. NAACP continues to keep colored there. Because what about but you find like Negro, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, right? Marcus Garvey, he's saying Negro. Du Bois is saying colored. It's very interesting. You know, you have this here changing. So here you have colored, and you can almost indicate the period of time when it comes about, when the book is written, or when the terminology is useful, what period of time, because it goes from African. Then you had an Afro-American, African-American for a while with different associations, organizations. Then Negro came into prominence, but it's not until like the 60s when you start having this here battle between whether we're black or African or African-American. So you can see the evolution then of the terminology. So that right away centers this book at a time where it maybe came into existence. Some kind of can be a revisionist or revert back to a period of time for some purposes. But I would think that this came, well, color, you figure anywhere from 1880s, 1890s to down to the Harlem Renaissance, color was quite useful in the black middle class. In the black middle class. But then Negro came in and competed with it. And that's when you have people who began to scream that Negro ought to be capitalized, because it was like in the lower case. People said, "Oh, you're gonna have to capitalize. You don't call me a Negro. You're gonna have to capitalize that in, you know." So, but that, what did you call yourself, as opposed to what somebody called you? The old thing is that it's not so much what people call you; it's what you answer to.
Herb, one of the reasons why I gave you that book is because it brings us so much closer to that period. People seem to think that that was a long time ago. Your grandmother was alive during that time, and I asked you in relationship to Black Wall Street, if that was an anomaly, and you told me that there were over 150 Black Wall Streets across the country.
Sure.
And they were all destroyed. But that book points out the kind of progress that blacks across the country
no doubt about
was making. And I had read some places said that during those 15 years after emancipation, the black made greater progress than any people in human history in terms of organizing, developing for themselves, structuring, and that Black Wall Street was just one achievement.
Oh, no doubt.
Can you talk about it?
Oh, yes, no doubt about it. You're absolutely right, though, in terms of the proliferation of these communities that empowered themselves through entrepreneurial zeal and creativity. Now, what was I? Back at the top of the year, I was invited to do a lecture out in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And of course, whenever they talk about Black Wall Street, and my wife comes from Oklahoma, one of the small black towns out there near Muskogee called Taft, Oklahoma. And she pretty much taught me what I know about Oklahoma's history from a black perspective. Her family was there for many, many years. And when we talk about the Tulsa situation, of course, Black Wall Street, or the Greenwood District, as they call it, that's a very important story. And they brought me out to the University of Tulsa to talk about the 1921 Tulsa riot. And that's the destruction. That's the destruction of Black Wall Street out there in Oklahoma. And it all was precipitated by one of those encounters, you know, where it's an accident, more or less, but accidents, and when you have a simmering discord among black and white people, there's a lot of tension and hostility that's brewing. All they need is one little catalyst, you know, one little incident that can spark it. And so white people being envious, you know, of black progress, were just looking for an opportunity to destroy that. So they used that particular incident to spur them into their whole mob behavior, and ended up killing, and there's still a lot of controversy about how many African American people were killed during the Tulsa riot. And as numbers as high as 115 to 300 again. So what it really meant in terms of the loss of human life is one thing, but property loss and the destruction of banks, stores, you know, people who had their black businesses that were really, really prospering, suddenly it's destroyed, it's gone, you know. I think about Ida B. Wells, you know, and her 3 friends who were lynched, you know, down in Memphis because they opened up a store across from a black grocery store. And obviously being black owned, black controlled, the black people, the customers, tended to support them and not the white store. And so that meant that their particular prosperity and profits diminished. And the Africans, they kind of excelled. And so the three black men who were the proprietors ended up being lynched out there. And that spurred Ida B. Wells, to begin her campaign against lynching in this country. Rosewood. I mean, we can go on and on with the communities. Even the one in Durham, North Carolina, is another one that was a very prominent economic development and what went on there. So some of it is a result. We know that when we have the riots and rebellions in American society, economics is at the base of it. Usually it's a struggle sometimes for jobs, because you have competition for jobs. Sometimes it's housing. And we can never forget the whole property question in terms of the American experience. People see that and measure. That's kind of like a quantitative measure, of your success, of making it, in the American dream, making it toward the American dream. So you're absolutely right, Clemson, in terms of trying to get your arms around, what was happening in parts of the country in the South post-Reconstruction, and for a short period of time, the county, how bountiful it was, for a number of African-American entrepreneurs, and some of them who fled the South and looking for even greater opportunities, with the Great Migration, of the 1920s. Mm-hmm. I mean, in my book, I talk about how Detroit and the influx of black people, particularly from Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, that arrived in Detroit once Henry Ford made that offer of $5 a day. Come on up here, as opposed to trying to make $5 a whole year, as a sharecropping. And sharecropping, I think that's probably the most immediate development that comes out of the Compromise of 1877. It's like, what happens to these black people who were virtually thrown back into slavery again? Into the convict lease system, where convicts who were serving time, and you could serve time for black people for almost anything. Vagrancy laws, for example, a number of African American peoples could not even walk the street. Because it was a vagrancy law. You had to have a job before sundown. Otherwise, you're going to jail. So many of the African Americans who ended up in prison and in jails later were, after they were confined, the only liberation they received was when they were kind of leased out to work on various projects for either other farmers or the community, the civic, the municipal development at that time. That was the only time they get out of breaking rocks on a chain gang. You can go ahead and work on a farm at that time. That was the convict lease system. Peonage, though, and the sharecropping, those are going to be the things that develop in terms of black survival. How do we survive? And you can work all year, on your farm.
My family came out of it.
Exactly.
Now, but we ended up owning almost 1,000 acres.
Well, that's an interesting development, because some parts of the South, particularly in South Carolina,
that's where we were.
Yeah, because one of the things about it, that at the close of the Civil War, many black people who had deeds to their land, I'm talking about so you had different kind of fibers of cotton, and the long fiber cotton was like, it was prominently grown in South Carolina, so when the Civil War was over, and a lot of the slaveholders came back to take their property, they met resistance in South Carolina, because they kept after they mustered out of the black soldiers, mustered out of the army, they kept their rifles, and they came home, they protect their property and beat back what you call these Bourbons. These reactionary Confederates coming back to take their property. This farm is gone. Because you remember 40 acres and a mule. that's another important development in terms of the failure of the government, the failure of the Congress to do anything about, protecting black lives. They matter nothing at all. I mean, you had the radical Republicans who proposed all that, and I certainly have a lot of respect and gratitude for Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, and a few other white radical Republicans who were very concerned about putting 40 acres and a mule into effect. The whole idea really came from Tecumseh, my man Sherman, and his march, his burned a path across the South right down to Atlanta. When Atlanta goes up in fire, people Gone with the Wind depicts that very well. But so what happened was that he's making this march across the South and tearing everything apart, liberating, emancipating slaves from one plantation to another. They just followed behind him. Ain't nowhere else to go, So he said, wait a minute now. He reaches out to the government, say, we have all of these contrabands of war, he called them at that time. And so the whole confiscation act had to be put into effect. All of this, Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner being the senator from Massachusetts, Thaddeus Stevens, a representative from Pennsylvania, began to propose that all of these contrabands of war be given 40 acres and a mule. That never made it out of committee.
There's a big picture of Sherman meeting black leaders of the community and asking them what they want. That picture is in, I've been there, sis. Okay, go ahead.
No, I think that just captures that particular moment and what he's caught in a dilemma, because he's got he's waging war, but you got all these contrabands of war, and many of them ended up being in service to Sherman, General Sherman. They worked to help him because certain kind of work his soldiers didn't have to do. These emancipated blacks following behind him were put to work. I mean, drive the wagons, dig the trenches, feed the soldiers. He put them to work. But then after it's all over, you're like, what do you do with them? And so at the same time, you have the situation going on with the Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens trying to put together this here act. Can we get it through Congress? It could not get through Congress. They said no, they did away with that. And of course, with Andrew Johnson coming in as the president, he much but destroyed all. I mean, that was the end of everything. 1877, with the Compromise of 1877, was a death knell, for the whole Freedmen's Bureau, and the Reconstruction era was over in 1977. So what you really do, you talk about American history picking up from that point, because when that's happening, where is Booker T. Washington? Where's Frederick Douglass? Because if you want to follow the American story, there's you can take 3 individuals and follow their lives, and it tells the American story up to the 20th century.
It does.
I mean, you look at the life of Booker T. Washington.
Tremendous. People underestimate.
Frederick Douglass,
Booker T.
W.B. Du Bois. And you have that whole trail, because each of them were involved in major incidents, episodes, milestones of American history in some kind of way. The 3 of them. Add Marcus Garvey to it, and you have the whole black nationalism and Pan-Africanism aspects. So those 4 men, is enough to embody a whole historical narrative. And particularly Frederick Douglass, because he's somebody who was in 1817 and died in 1895. So he had a long, long stretch of time in which he was such a prominent player in all these major incidents. More than just being a bystander, but a pivotal force. Who was right in there. And when he died in 1895, the door opened for Booker T. Washington. And Washington is going to be there up until 1915. He's dead and gone. When he's dead and gone, Du Bois carries it all the way down to the 20th century, 1963, August 28th, eve of the March on Washington. So there's a long expanse of it. You study their lives, and you add maybe Zora Neale Hurston, Ida B. Wells, add those women in there so you can get the whole gender question and what they're struggling for, along with Anna Julia Cooper. Then you begin to get some kind of the matrix, then the tapestry is filled out in such a way that you get a good feel for the dynamic aspects of the struggle that we waged in this country. And we did in every war. You know, we participated in all of these wars this country has waged, you know, whether in our behalf or not. You know, 1812, boom, 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 we can talk about that, you know, in terms of Andrew Jackson, right down to the Civil War, the Revolution, go back to the Revolutionary War, we were there. You know, Crispus Attucks, he was the first of all. You know, Salem Poor, Peter Salem, Barzalou Lowe, all those individuals, they made tremendous contributions on the battlefield. Then you get down to World War I, or even that Spanish-American War of 1898, you know, with Teddy Roosevelt, opportunistic individual that he was, and self-serving. You know, what he had to say about the black soldiers at that time who saved his ass, you know, at San Juan Hill in Las Guasimas. You know, those so-called Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. He ran into hell there. But it was the 9th and 10th Cavalry that came to the rescue and saved him.
And that was the black.
Isn't that something? And then he kind of disparaged them. By 1900, turn of the century, 1901, 1902, 1905, when he's kind of like emerging as this political leader, becoming the president of this country, he denounces the black troops. He said he had to put a gun to their head because they were cowards and didn't want to go into battle. I mean, that's what happens, you know. He had to do that. It was politically expedient for him to say that to those Dixiecrats at that time, because he's trying to become the president. So he's trying to earn their favor, so he can dismiss, you know, the black troops who really saved his behind. So, I mean, but that's the kind of story we run into all the time. It's like, even the Buffalo Soldiers, you start talking about, you know, is that good, is that bad? But in one degree, it's terrible. Because they, you know, be heroes because they were part of the decimation of the Native American population. They would come to Custer's rescue. You dig it? So, you know, the whole situation there is that, you know, killing Native Americans don't make you a hero. So sometimes we have to correct the record and make it clear that when Bob Marley is talking about Buffalo Soldier, you know, and kind of heroic aspects, in one way you can talk about maybe the whole Spanish-American War, and the 9th and the 10th Cavalry down there. And even that draws into question the whole imperialistic aspects of the American enterprise, because we have to be concerned about that too. So, I mean, it's just such a dynamic story that has so many interesting chapters.
Okay.
No matter what chapter you choose, there's a story there.
Yeah, I wanted to deal with Booker T. Washington.
Oh, goodness.
Because I see his story so dynamic and so intricate with how Africans after emancipation got a focus and were trained in all of the skills. In fact, so much so that unions, the unions later were organized really to dislodge blacks from the workforce because blacks held the permanent skills, architecture, all those skills were held by blacks. And so the Europeans coming here came with the blessing of the union, which they became a part of, to dislodge. So I wanted you to speak on that. Because
that's a very interesting thing, Clemson. Oh, brother.
And that comes out of Tuskegee Institute.
Oh, sure.
For most parts. So you begin to see how the laying of you know, the black community and how it was so intricately unified.
Unified in that
So
way.
if you could
Well, see, first of all, my story with Alabama, I was born in Alabama. I was born in Birmingham, but I spent the first 4 years of my life just outside of Tuskegee. It's called, it was named after my grandfather.
Tuskegee?
You know, yeah, Cotton Valley.
Okay.
Cotton Valley is right outside of Tuskegee there. But my grandfather went to the Tuskegee Institute, and my father too. They both were graduates of Tuskegee Institute. So I learned a lot about that when I discovered that they were part of that. In fact, I was telling Assemblyman Bruce Wright, Keith Wright, we were talking about his father, Bruce, who's Tournament Loose Bruce, Judge Wright.
I got footage on it.
Well, our fathers were together down in Alabama, and it was called Fort Rucker. And but Bruce Wright used to call it Fort Mother Rucker. I mean, he would talk about how bad it was that and that base and that camp down there. But yeah, but Tuskegee has a very interesting history because here's an institution. Booker T. Washington was a graduate of Hampton Institute. And many of the ideas, concepts, ingenuity, pedagogy, he got while he was at Hampton. Because, you know, the whole president at that time, Samuel Armstrong, embraced him. Armstrong was an old war veteran out of the Civil War, and embraced him. And here's this young man who had such aspirations, such desire, determination for education, that he walked those long miles from West Virginia to matriculate at Hampton Institute, which was really old, had been founded to take care of Native Americans. But by the time the end of the Civil War, more blacks were going to Hampton. So that's where Booker T ended up as a student. And his test, his entrance examination, they gave him a broom and a rags to clean up a room. And then later on, the inspector came back with some white gloves, almost like the white glove inspection had in the Army, and ran his finger along the top of one of the doors, and it came out lily white, and he was led into the college. So it's a hell of an entrance exam, right? So he got in there, and once he got in as a student and distinguished himself, later on they offered him a teaching position there, and he did it for a hot minute. But he was a dreamer. And he began to talk about self-determination, do for self. He's a progenitor of that whole concept of do for self, that later on you're going to have that Marcus Garvey picks it up. And the kind of correspondence between Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey is just fabulous. You can read some of those letters. There's at least about 5 letters exchanged between them. At last it was cut off when Marcus began to beg for some money and a ticket to come to America. Booker T said, I ain't got no money. So that was over, you know. But at the same time, you know, that's that do for self that later on Elijah Muhammad picked it up from Marcus Garvey, you know. So it starts with Booker T. So he has this dream of putting together his own college. And it's a long and beautiful story that he tells in his autobiography, Up from Slavery. And I think that's one of the slave narratives, you know, a very important part of understanding our history and culture. If you go back and study those, but I don't think it's any better than Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass in terms of capturing the kind of tenor of the times, you might say, what was going on, because they endured a whole lot of pain in order to get that progress. But so Booker T. Washington, so when he had this idea of putting together his own institute, then he had to raise the money. Because he had already endeared himself to Mr. Armstrong, and Mr. Armstrong began to put him in contact with, you know, the Peabodys and the Rosenwald, some of those white entrepreneurs of the day began to give him the seed money he needed. Then it was a matter of like, where are you going to do it? He said Tuskegee. He went down, he scouted the lay of the land and found out that, you know, he could appeal to certain individuals, but he had to say to them, okay, we'll help you out in this enterprise, but this school, you can have no, in other words, the whole radical militant thing can't be a part of this educational process. You have to assure us, that they're not going to be radicalized in any way. So he made certain guarantees that his educational process was one of empowering them with skills. So that's where you get into the whole training aspect. You get into developing skills, like brick masons and carpenters. They so much so they built their own school.
Every brick.
That's right. They put together, they made the bricks, to build a school. So that shows the ingenuity that they had. So that's really the beginning of this kind of skills development. And later on, George Washington Carver, will be a part of that and begin to expand it in terms of botanical and agricultural and experimentation and the crossbreeding of this and working with peanut butter and what have you, peanuts and what have you. So all of that's a part of expanding the school and also begin to making connections with Africa.
Yes.
That's another element that you find that Booker T. Washington, he was an institutional builder. He was an empire man. I'm gonna build me an empire. And that was his empire. And it was gonna empower him in such a way that when Douglass dies in 1895, and Booker T spoke down in Atlanta at the Cotton Exposition, he turned it out. That was another compromise.
Yeah,
I mean, the compromise is how we get back to that word. But that certainly was, and one in which they could kind of, okay, who's gonna take Douglass's place as a mouthpiece or spokesperson, representative of black people in this country? And he just said, clear up, hey, you don't have to worry about us being a threat, because we just want to, do that, be a service. We want to be your servants. We'll be the heroes and drawers of water. You don't have to worry about us, So that was so comforting.
I have to add this, because Dr. Clark would make you fall out of your seat laughing. He said, Dr. Clark, going over the speech, he said that Booker T said, we even followed you with tears streaming down our eyes to your grave. And Dr. Clark said, now that was a bit much.
Really? Dudley Randall is a very fine poet in Detroit, a friend of mine over the years. He wrote a poem on Booker T and W.E.B., right? Yeah. You ever see that poem?
No.
It seems to me, says Booker T, well, I don't agree, says W.E.B. And that's the kernel of the poem, and it goes on like that in terms of the general disagreement. But I think one of the things is that Booker T's life so often contrasted with Du Bois's life. And I think that, I don't think it's a fair comparison in terms of, who they were. One's a son of the South, the other one comes from the North. One is has different kind of dreams and ambitions as opposed to the other. So there's some distinctions there. There are great differences in terms of their ideological, pedagogical, to say nothing of their political approaches, in terms of what the aspirations that they had. And to a large degree, we have to see where do they complement each other? How do they come together, the convergence? Same way we do with Dr. King and Malcolm. You try to find those convergence territories, and suddenly if he had lived long enough, he's dead in 1915.
Right.
Booker T is gone. And so you begin to look at the legacy that he left behind from an educational standpoint. It's tremendous. He left, when Moulton took over and ran that school, he had a blueprint already laid out in terms of reaching out to making sure, first of all, the money keeps coming in. Because, the tuition, being what it was not enough to sustain the school. You have to get grants. You have to get, the charitable organizations, these institutions come in and help you with support. Booker T had set all that in place. All that was set up. I mean, he was getting grants all over the place with the Peabody, the Rosenwald, to say nothing of Andrew Carnegie. Gave him $600,000 even to start Tuskegee Institute. So that's an important connection. Oh, yeah.
$1 billion.
I mean, compared, shoot. But then from Booker T to WB, Marcus Garvey. That was a hell of a period, and that kind of brain power, that kind of political vision. If you could like put it all on the same page and put them all in the same room and they're all in agreement, it would be tremendous progress for the people. I mean, I think the kind of bickering and arguing, the contentious aspects was kind of self-defeating. You know, it kind of held us back to a great degree. And all it did was empower, you know, the oppressor again. They could stand back and watch y'all fight. When elephants fight, only the grass suffers. So, you know, you watch y'all go, so we run off with the spoils belong to us, and where y'all fight each other. And so some of that was certainly the provocative aspects. You know, we know exactly where that was coming from. And that was a part of those evil, menacing forces that we've always had to deal with in our community in order to survive as a people. You know, how we begin to deal with these intruders who come in and terrorize us and misinform and misdirect, hoodwink and bamboozle us. How do we begin to deal with that? So it's a certain kind of marshaling, that unification you talked about earlier. You know, we begin to get some elements of that during the civil rights movement, where these forces are coming together. And they're coming from different arenas and different sections and different attitudes and class. You know, the attitudes that they were bringing was, you know, it's good that it was diversified, because we needed that diversification, you know, and bring it all. How do you consolidate that diversification and utilize it in such a way to move forward? And I think we saw where those individuals, I mean, more and more importance and leadership should have been given to Black women. I think that was one of the lackings.
Today.
Huh?
I think you are seeing
I think so.
more and more Black
I think so.
leadership being given to Black women because they're in jail over the 2 million.
Believe me, it was just, that's an interesting point, because it was just discussed the other day. And I was looking at, even Sharpton's had a press conference, had a press conference yesterday, the whole separation of families down there in the Capitol Hill. And I was looking at the composition of the people around him. The majority were Black women. He had one Black man there with him. That was Derek Johnson, who heads up the NAACP now. Oh, he had one other, Mark Morial from the Urban League. He had gone when the general photo was being taken. But that's true, because the whole education, we look at, I've been teaching at City College now since 2005. Before that, I taught at the College of New Rochelle for 26 years. I can count the number of Black men I had in those classes, particularly at the College of New Rochelle. Because usually I used to average like 30-some students in the classroom. Maybe one or two will be a Black male.
But you are seeing the manifestation of that today.
The disappearance, you know.
The problem that I see with it is that you are having a tremendous amount of integration, intermarriage with Black women and white men. And that can be used as a cutting edge against the Black male. And it's been, I mean, all you gotta do is look at commercials. Commercials have a focal point to say to the Black woman, you don't need the Black man, we got you covered. And that, in the long run, annihilates the Black race. It diminishes our unity, and it also diminishes our strength in terms of our melanin and in terms of our focus. But I'm in love with Black women, and I will have to trust their focus that these are their children, and this is their nation.
Yeah.
And somehow I have to believe that deep inside they will make the right decision, though I am not sure about it.
That's important. That's a concern. That's a very important one. And it doesn't even have to be whispered conspiratorially, because there's social forces that are bringing about these very, very, when you say we're being demolished. I was just this morning, my wife and I had a long discussion on the young police officers, first day on the job and given a gun, he guns down a black man. So we become like casualty fatalities. Then you look at the whole prison industrial complex, the mass incarceration. And we're not in the, so in other words, we're not even in the pool when they dip in there to lift out candidates and potential this and potential that. And they look at the pool, they look at this whole ladle of water, and there's nothing but black women in there. You know, they're not in the graduate schools, they're not even in the undergraduate schools, and they don't make it all the way through. For some reason or other, they disappear before graduation. They're not graduating. Good thing they are coming out of some of the schools, but then, you know, the numbers are small in terms of specialized education, for example. The situations going here in New York City is endemic. What's happening across the country? I mean, you see education system in the state of Michigan, for example. We have 1 million school children. We have 1 million in our public school system here in New York City. But 1 million in the state of Michigan, and how many of them are in charter schools? You know, and so in other words, you know, in terms of being cut off from a certain kind of educational opportunities, you know, a lottery system, you know, only a few of you can get in. The rest of you, the public school system is falling apart. It's under state control in Michigan, for example. And they're not alone in that in terms of the whole dismissal, you know, of the people talking, well, where are the black men? The school kids was asking me the other day, wanted me to come over and talk to some 6, 7-year-olds. Say, well, we haven't had a black man come talk to us in a long time. You know.
Why is it, Herb? What is happening? How is the modus operandi that creates that? That you know, promoting it is easy enough, but it's not just promoted, it's institutionalized on every level to make sure that it's a reality. What's the modus operandi, and how can we
Well, I'm an optimist, and if I can get 1 or 2 out of 30, and they're properly empowered and given some support, they got to be supported. They can't get that feeling that they're alone. You got to kill that. You're not alone. You got people out here who give you that assistance if you reach out for it. We have to learn how to collectively, how do we move together in a concerted way and not feel that it's a singular battle that we have to wage. A young lady just wrote me this morning her email, and she was so excited. She got into this graduate program at CUNY, and she was like praising me for the letter I wrote for her. I said, "Wasn't the letter? It's your academic record. Check that out." And so you have to understand that, and you got to pass it on in that way. You can't say there's no one individual gave you that opportunity. Don't do that. It's your academic record. That has to be emulated. That has to be transferred. That has to be told to others. You know, that you worked hard. It's good to have, you know, one of those powerful letters to come in to help you, but at the same time, you can't negate, you know, what you have done in order to get to that level of appreciation and evaluation. You know, we need to have more and more. I try to grab these young men. If I get one or two of them, I mean, they're mine. I got them. And they stay right with me. They send me, they communicate, they call me, they have events, they come out for. You saw,
Yes.
you know how they come out.
Right.
You know, the young people, and it has to be that intergenerational thing too. I think that's absolutely important. Black Lives Matter has to be married with the Black Liberation Movement. In other words, BLM has to come together with BLM. Got to bring them together, and they got to have a dialogue, discourse, so the elders can tell them some of the strengths and weaknesses of the struggle, because we're still kind of struggling to understand exactly what went down in the 60s. You need more and more discussion, more and more analysis. And I'm glad to see that a number of young people are grappling with that, trying to understand, like, you know, boom, boom, boom. We got a book coming out on this Black Panther film, that you are part of it. And the discussion there is like, is this film positive or is it negative? Or is it a combination of both? And so you let some 40 submissions, you let these individuals go ahead and let them argue their points, put their impressions out there. But that's just one book. You know, we need to have that happening there's a new film coming out called Black Klansman. It should spur the same kind of discussion. This is Spike Lee's latest joint. And I just got through looking at it 2 weeks ago and wrote my review of it. And then I saw 2 days ago, I went to see Boots Riley's film, Hey, Sorry to Bother You. And this is this telemarketer. It's just a bizarre film. It's it's got a lot going on in it, but for the most part, it's a very messy film, but hilarious. A real send-up, you know. But here's the two Black films out there, along with the Black Panther film. Get Out was before that, where people were talking about that. It didn't get the traction I thought it should have. Now Jordan Peele is back with the Black Klansman, working with Spike Lee. So you're going to have a lot. That opens in August. So you'll see that maybe it's spur, and I may want to do the same kind of thing in a different, not how we do in Black Panther, but I think we need to move on to talk about some of our elders out there who have stories to tell in terms of their Black intellectual and political development. We got to get a few of those stories. Haki and I talked about it the other day. That's probably our next project, is to round up the Ivor Carruthers and Jacob Carruthers, and round up the Molana Karinga or Molefe and Dr. Jeffries.
Yes.
Oh yeah, we need to get those individuals to give us some success stories that they could pass on to the next, because you know the twilight is coming in, the August of our days upon us. And we need to have those. Some of them have not taken the time to put their stories down. Dr. J still has not. He's been threatening to do it. Molana hasn't done it. Molefe hasn't done it. Haki has done it a little bit more than they. Amiri didn't do it. He did a little bit out there, but that stuff was just so bizarre and weird and full of misinformation. I guess he couldn't tell the truth. So he had to lie about some stuff in his own life and dismiss some folks who were instrumental in his development. You know, so that doesn't work. Some I have to go ahead and have an analysis of some of these stuff that comes out like that, but some of these important leaders and thinkers that we've had, their stories need to be brought together in such a way as that can be instructive, you know, for the next generation, so they can see some of these are the iconic, these are our heroes and sheroes, and we need to know their stories and the obstacles they had to overcome in order to achieve, you know, a certain kind of celebrity, notoriety, and possibility.
Yes.
That they have right now. So that's going to probably be our next project. I talked to Cortland Cox. I talked to Charlie Cobb. Some of the old people who were veterans of the civil rights movement, because you want to key it, in the same way as a Bobby Seale is pretty much the last of the Black Panthers, other than 3 or 4 of the women, Kathleen Cleaver and Elaine Brown, Erica Huggins. They're still around, but their stories need to be part of that. What happened with the Panther? In terms of COINTELPRO, what happened with the whole attack on them and destroyed the organization, and then what things that they do that would be that they wouldn't do again. What mistakes did you make, and be honest about that. You can talk about, I was empowered by this, or I took advantage of this, but then what are some of those things that were debilitating, that hurt you, and hurt the movement, that you wouldn't even think about doing again? So that's probably going to be our next project, along with, whatever documents that you want to do. But I think the Professor Oyibo is something that we need to do a better job of getting it out there to, as you suggest, can we get it on the front page, of some of these publications, and give him the kind of attention and the kind of recognition. He's already received quite a bit, I understand that, but it's still on a popular level.
Yeah.
How can that resonate in such a way as that we can take that, and I think what you've done in the Black Panther book, because I use you right at the open, and I use you in the close. So you kind of bookend.
Oh.
You bookend the book for me. You'll see how I did it.
Can't wait for it to get out of here.
Oh, yeah. But I think one of the things that kind of summarize things here is that there's so much. I was looking over David Levering Lewis, just a phenomenal historian. And he did these, the volumes, the 2 very, very magnificent volumes on the life of W.E.B. Du Bois. So I was looking over that the other day in preparation for our discussion. And I was looking and saying, my goodness, here's this man, almost from the very beginning. He's 25 years of age, Du Bois was. And he began to lay out a blueprint for his life, and then went and did it. That's just simply amazing that you can have that kind of perspective, that kind of vision at that early age, and begin to see exactly how you want to move across the years and ultimately end up with that desired end. Now, this is a remarkable story. So, but that's obviously, he had a lot of help along the way. And at the same time, he had to know that he had to be absolutely, the empowering aspects, from one episode of his life to another, and how he began to take advantage of all the stuff around him. All the other individuals he had contact with, institutions and organizations, the NAACP, Harvard University. So these doors that opened for him, he got in there, but he was able to not lose his perspective. They may have had some other kind of means and devious ways of moving him off and being very distracting, but he was not distracted. He stayed dead on it right to the end. He wanted to compile. I had an opportunity when I was in Africa to go to Ghana and go to his house and see what he had left behind. It's just tremendous. I walked through Dr. Clark's house, and I've been in Clemson Brown's basement, but that's what I'm talking about in terms of the accumulation of information and how we got to take that stuff and make it available to people who will never have an opportunity to go to your basement, to go to Ghana. Dr. Clark's house is gone. His stuff is not, some universities got it, heaven only knows what they're going to do with it.
Trump University?
Trump?
I didn't know that.
Clark is down in Emory University. That's where Dr. Clark's stuff is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought you said Trump.
Yeah. We need to find some kind of way to make that material and circulate it.
Well,
Being put in somebody's in the archives or repository, only scholars can get to it. Only they will know about it. Same thing with Malcolm's stuff, you know. We're still waiting to see how that's going to be, you know, completed. I mean, you got film stuff never been developed.
wow.
I mean, Malcolm kept a camera all the time. After a while, heaven only knows if it in canisters how it's kept and preserved, but it'll shrivel up, dry up, and gone. If you can keep it under the right conditions,
That's true.
it's gone. So there's so much work to be done yet that is still there to be done. It's not like you got to reinvent that stuff. It's there.
Right.
Where's the scholarship and where's the availability and where's the thinkers who are running these institutions have enough vision to bring folks in and take care of that work? I mean, look at the Schomburg, you know, they bring in some young person who he's already pulled off in one direction here, you know, working with white folks downtown. You know, that's going to take away from your impetus at that particular institution. It's got to hurt you. You know, you can't be like serving all these different muses. It's hard to do that. So you got to get focused there. Do something about what you got in your hand as opposed to running here. I know that it's very lucrative sometimes to take over one of these white publications as an editor. But at the same time, they've given you a position of power right in your own community. And you're more concerned about doing a deed somewhere else. But that's just one part of the problem, you know, in terms of work we got to do. I mean, it's some of these historically black colleges and universities, they got a lot of work to do too.
It is amazing.
Mm-hmm. No, that Howard Dotson is kind of well placed. I'm curious on how long and what is he doing down there, the Moreland Spin Garn, you know, down at Howard University, that collection. That's a tremendous collection. You know, we need to compile our collection, Clemson.
Are you
Whoa, we could bring that together. Wow.
Because I got a piece of Dotson authorized to be done on the African burial ground. So
Whoa.
it's personal, hands-on, and he appointed me as the official documentarian. So I have all of the footage from, we started in Washington, D.C., back to the interment.
Is that right?
Yeah, all of it. Of course, you know, they paid me to do it. They didn't pay me much. They should have paid me 3 or 4 times.
How is that? Now, I've seen parts of it.
I got it all because I shot it.
Because we knew when they went down there to the waterfront.
Yeah, I got everything. Yeah. I had a crew. I took a crew. And we shot every minute of it. From beginning to end.
So is that like an hour-long production setup?
No, it hasn't been produced. It's the raw. I got the raw footage. I didn't. I gave them a copy. But I kept the masters. I had to get them a copy.
Has it been digitized?
No. I'm trying to digitize this footage now.
That stuff is like
and I got probably 10,000 hours.
Expensive too.
Yeah, it is expensive. So, but what I'm doing is trying to tell the story. Now I'm trying to tighten the story. That's why I wanted to do this interview with you, so that colleges, universities, families, and I'm really putting it together in such a way that we start with the origins of man and we move through a timeline to issues and events today so that everything is there. Okay. Africa before European contact. Values and spirituality in Africa. Egypt, soars above, soars below. 20,000 years of Egyptian history. The fall of Egypt, Greece and Rome. Africans in the Americas. The Olmec civilization, the rise of West Africa, Rome. continues. The Dark Ages of Europe. The African impact on Europe, 700 AD to 1492. The rise of West
J.A.
Africa
Rogers.
continues. Ghana, Mali, Sungay Empire. The Moors in Europe. European invasions of South Africa. How the Sungay Empire was destroyed. The gun made the difference. The Berlin Conference, the scramble for Africa. Walter Rodney. The Industrial Revolution in Europe and America. Its impact on Africa. 1,000 ships on the sea, the triangle trade, slave trade. The economics of the slave trade. The demonic Middle Passage. Slavery becomes the law of the land. Resistance to enslavement. 1482, 1884. Resistance on the African continent. Resistance at sea. Resistance in the Americas. The Seminoles and African Americans united. 1 million Africans killed and displaced in Africa during the invasion and slave trade. Cotton, rice, and indigo, the basics of the economics of the West. The killing of African, the killing of African, animals such as the elephant and so forth. You know, for every two tusks that made it, 10 villages were destroyed. People don't understand. And now you see these pictures, you see Africans as the poachers, killing. But that's Europeans. Donald Trump's son loves Africans. They ain't killing all that. They've been with the animals all of their life. Right. They might kill a few or some, and then they are paid.
The rhinoceros, taking that aphrodisias.
I was watching a piece on, I think it was 60 Minutes or something, but the only person that they end up catching was a black man.
Yes, there's
the legal impact of it.
Well, you got a lot of stuff there.
The struggle and the Africans.
So you got 10 volumes there, baby.
So
I'd like to come back and do the more of a contemporary thing. I think my real strength is modern and not ancient. I can do ancient stuff, but I prefer the 20th century.
Okay.
That's my strength, is the 20th century. The working, the unions, the education, the literary, the music, all those things, come out of the 20th century. I feel a lot more comfortable and authoritative on those issues. As if we parcel off some areas where we can just focus on that and that alone, as we did in several instances here. But I think when you get into the 1920s, that's when I should be called back in.
Okay.
Let me do 20th century world history.
I would love it.
20th century world history. What time we got? 5 o'clock? I need to.
Well, if we're gonna do this, I'm gonna thank you.
No,
I let you go.
Hey, I owe you, man. Shoot, you take.